everything. I really did. Hi! It all literally just left my head. Okay, um, I'm gonna start. Okay, next time I'm gonna have cards. I'm Ever since I was a little kid, I've been dying to share this book series with literally anybody. It's called 13 Treasures by Michelle Harrison, and there are two more books, 13 Curses and 13 Secrets. I highly recommend them to literally everybody. It's about fairies, but like not what comes to your mind when you think of fairies. And it is an absolutely amazing book, and I'm kind of inspired by Tori Pence's live Instagram readings of The Scarlet Pimpernel. Um, so I am going to start doing that right now. Let's see. 13 Treasures by Michelle Harrison, Chapter 1. Beautiful artwork. You wouldn't be able to see it on the camera. Hey, monkey. She was aware of their presence in the room before she even awoke. An ominous twitching had begun in Tanya's eyelids, a sure sign that trouble was on its way. Her eyes opened groggily. As usual, she had reverted to her childhood habit of sleeping with her head under the covers. She was uncomfortable, yet reluctant to shift position. If she did, it would alert them to the fact that she was awake. Beneath the stifling covers, Tanya longed to kick the sheets back and allow the soft summer breeze drifting through the windows to wash over her. She tried to tell herself she had dreamed it. Maybe they were not really there after all. Still, she lay unmoving, for deep down she knew they were there, as surely as she knew she was the only one who could see them. Through the covers she could sense them, could feel the energy in the room charged with the air in the room charged with a strange energy. She could even smell the earthy dampness of leaves, fungi, and ripened berries. It was their smell. A quiet voice cut through the darkness. She sleeps. Should I rouse her? Tanya stiffened beneath her sanctuary of sheets. She still had bruises from the last time they had pinched her black and blue. A sharp prod in the ribs made her gasp. She is not asleep. The second voice was cold, controlled. She is pretending. No matter. I do so enjoy these little games. The last traces of drowsiness left her then. There was no mistaking the underlying threat in those words. Tanya prepared to throw back the sheets, but they were strangely heavy all of a sudden, weighing down on her, and they were growing steadily heavier. What's happening? What are you doing? She clawed at the sheets, frantically trying to push them away. They seemed to be wrapping themselves around her like a cocoon. For one terrifying moment, she struggled for breath before managing to free her head and suck in a lungful of cool night air. It was several seconds before she noticed that the glass star lantern covering the bedroom light bulb was directly in front of her face. Suddenly, Tanya realized why the bedclothes were so heavy. She was floating in midair, 5 feet above her bed, supporting the full weight of them. Put me down! Slowly, through no control of her own, she began turning sideways in the air. The bedclothes promptly slid off and fell onto the carpet, leaving Tanya hovering face down above her bed in her pajamas. Without the shelter of the covers, she felt horribly vulnerable. She pulled her hair back from her face and scanned the room. The only living thing she saw in the darkness was the cat, a ridiculous fluffy gray Persian curled in a ball on the windowsill. It got up, giving her a haughty look before turning its back to her and settling down once more. "Where are you?" she said, her voice shaking. "Show yourselves!" An unpleasant laugh sounded from somewhere near the bed. Tanya felt herself being propelled forward, and before she knew what was happening, she had turned a full somersault in the air, followed by another and another. "Just stop it!" She heard the desperation in her voice and hated it. The somersaulting stopped, and finally she landed on her feet, upside down, on the ceiling. The curtains billowed weirdly in the breeze. She averted her eyes, trying to steady herself. It was as if gravity had reversed, for her only. Blood was not rushing to her head, her pajamas were not falling upward, and her hair was now tumbling down her back. She sat down on the ceiling, defeated. This was the reason they came in the middle of the night. She had figured that out much long ago. She had figured that much out a long time ago. At night she was completely at their mercy, whereas in the day, if she happened to be caught in any strange situation, she had a far better chance of passing it off as a trick or some kind of game. Just one of many games and tricks over the years. She couldn't remember the first time she had seen them exactly. They had always been there. She had grown up chattering away to herself as her parents looked on, first in amusement, then later with concern. As the years passed, she had learned to lie convincingly. Talk of fairies did not wash well with adults once you were past a certain age. They were in, there were no more of the knowing looks and fond smiles that came with infancy. Tanya did not take it too personally. People didn't believe in what they couldn't see. The incidents had become more vindictive of late. It was one thing to have having to cut a few tangles after an encounter with an enchanted hairbrush, or finding that the answers to homework had been mysteriously tampered with overnight. Oh, honey. But this was serious. For months now, Tanya had harbored a nagging worry that eventually something bad was going to happen, something she couldn't explain her way out of. Her worst fear was that her increasingly weird behavior would land her on the couch of a psychiatrist. Floating around in the air was not a good predicament. If her mother awoke to find her walking about on the ceiling, it wouldn't be a doctor she called, it would be a vicar. She was in trouble of the worst kind. There was a waft of cool air on her face, and Tanya felt the brush of a feathered wing skim her cheek. A large black bird swooped on her shoulder, its glittering eyes blinking once before the bird morphed as quickly as a shadow would vanish in the sun. Silken black hair and the pinkish tips of two pointed ears replaced the cruel curved beak, as a woman, not much larger than the bird, shifted into place. She wore a gown of black feathers. It was stark against her ivory skin. Raven, Tanya whispered. She watched as a feather from the fairy's dress floated lightly to the floor. Why are you here? Raven did not answer. She alighted at the foot of the bed, next to two small figures, one plump and ruddy-nosed, the other dark-skinned, wiry, and skittish-looking. Both were watching her intently. The smaller of the two was the first to speak. You've been writing about us again. Tanya felt her face burn. I haven't, Greddon. I didn't. Greddon's yellow eyes glittered, shockingly bright in contrast to his dark brown face. But that's what you said last time, and the time before. Outside, a dark rectangular object was drifting toward the open window, as though carried on the breeze. It soared gracefully through the curtains and into the room. It halted before Tanya's dismayed face. It was a journal, fairly new and in good condition, but covered in soil. She had buried it beneath the apple tree in the garden that afternoon. How foolish she had been. Yours, I believe, said Greddon. I've never seen it before. The plump little fellow next to Greddon snorted. Oh, come now, he said. You wouldn't want to be up there all night, would you? He reached up and gave the peacock feather in his cap a light stroke, then twisted his ratty mustache around his forefinger. The feather shimmered at his touch, rich with enchantment. The fat little man removed the quill from his cap and gave it a deft flick. The diary opened, releasing a clod of earth that fell to the floor and broke over one of Tanya's slippers. A muffled sneeze came from inside the slipper, and then a fourth and final fairy emerged from inside. Hug-like and ugly, the creature beat its ragged brown wings with some effort and landed in a clumsy heap on the bed. After regaining its balance, it began scratching vigorously, showering the bedclothes with molting fur and fleas, then gave a cavernous yawn, rubbing its snout with tiny brown paws. Once, when she was smaller, and before her parents' divorce, Tanya had been sulking ungraciously after a telling-off. After a few minutes, her mother had snapped. Don't be such a little miss-hog. What's a miss-hog? Tanya asked, curious despite herself. It's a horrible, hoggy creature that's always miserable, her mother had replied. And with that face you're pulling, you look just like one. Oh my gosh, I forgot they're British. Okay. There was something Tanya remembered every time she saw the flea bit. This was something Tanya remembered every time she saw the flea-bitten brown fairy. Its hangdog expression fit the description of her mother's invented creature so perfectly that, in her own mind, Tanya would forever think of it as a Mizhog. As the creature, unlike the other fairies, had never put forth a name for itself, the name Tanya had selected stuck. Aside from its fleas and the smell, which reminded her of a wet dog, the Mizhog was fairly unobtrusive. It never spoke, at least not in any language Tanya understood, and was always hungry, and it had a habit of scratching its belly. Other than that, it seemed to observe its surroundings with its soulful brown eyes. It seemed happy to observe its surroundings with its soulful brown eyes, the only one of its features that could be described as beautiful. It stared up at her now, wide-eyed and unblinking, making strange little snuffling noises in its throat. The diary bobbed in front of Tanya's face. Hastily, she returned her attention to it. Read it, said Greddon. I can't, said Tanya. It's too dark. Greddon's eyes were hard as flint. The pages of the diary began turning frenziedly this way and that, as if trying to decide on an entry to settle upon. Eventually they rested on a particularly rushed-looking passage toward the end. Hang on, need my water. Tanya recognized the date immediately. It was less than 2 weeks ago. The writing was barely legible. Her eyes had been so blurred with tears that she had hardly been able to see her own hand. Then the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as her own voice echoed softly through the page, not quite loud enough to wake anyone, but certainly loud enough for her to hear. It sounded distant, as though its journey through time had weakened it. They came again tonight. Why me? I hate them, hate them! The excruciating passage went on, and Tanya could only listen in horror as her voice spilled from the diary, recounting one page after another, angry, frustrated, and hopeless. The fairies watched her all the while, Raven subdued, Feathercap and Greddon stony-faced, and the Mizhog scratching its flea-infested belly, disinterested. Enough, said Greddon after what seemed like an age. Tanya's voice broke off immediately, leaving only the sound of pages flicking back and forth, as if by some invisible hand. Before her eyes, every word she had written slowly faded and vanished like ink drawn into blotting paper. The diary fell to the bed, disintegrating on impact. There is nothing to be gained from this, said Raven, gesturing to what was left of it. You will only bring misery to yourself. Not if someone had read it one day, Tanya said bitterly, and believed me. The rules are simple, said Feathercap. You speak of us to no one. If you continue to try, then we will continue to punish you. The remnants of the diary stirred on the bed, lifting from the covers like fine sand before flying through the open window out into the night. Gone, as if it never was, said Greddon, to a place where rosemary grows by a stream that flows uphill, the domain of the Piskies. I don't believe in any stream that flows uphill, said Tanya, still smarting from having her innermost thoughts broadcast for all to hear. Heathen creatures, Piskies, Greddon continued. Unpredictable, dangerous, some say. Whatever they touch becomes twisted and warped. And the rosemary, otherwise renowned for its aid to memory, grows tainted. The properties are reversed. He paused for effect. Such a drama queen. Tanya, wisely sensing this, did not interrupt again. Now, there are some folk known to the fairies as the cunning folk, who are similar with... Now there are some folk, known to the fairies as the cunning folk, who are familiar with the qualities of herbs and plants such as rosemary, for even pisky-tainted rosemary has its uses. In the correct quantities, it has the power to extract a memory from a mortal head forever, such as the memory of an old sweetheart. Very helpful in some circumstances, but the fairies, much as it pains them to have any dealings of any kind with the filthy little piskies, also have their own uses for this magical herb. It comes in particularly useful when humans stumble upon the fairy realm unexpectedly and witness things they have no business seeing. Usually a small dose sets the situation right, and the human is none the worse for it, seemingly wakening from a pleasant dream, albeit with no recollection of what the dream was about. However, it has been known to be administered in the wrong quantities, entire memories have been wiped just like that. Greddon snapped his fingers, and Tanya flinched. Of course, this is mostly accidental and rare, but sometimes, just sometimes, it is used as a last resort to silence those who otherwise refuse to be silenced. A highly unpleasant fate, most would agree. The poor souls can't even remember their own names afterward. Unfortunate, but necessary. After all, one cannot speak of what one does not remember. Tanya suddenly tasted fear in her mouth. I won't write about you again. Good, said Feathercap, for you would be a fool to attempt it. Just one more thing, said Tanya bravely, as she dared. I can't be the only one. I know I'm not the only one. Greddon silenced her with a look. Her descent was sudden and unexpected. Feeling herself begin to fall, Tanya instinctively grabbed the only thing at hand, the star lantern covering the light bulb. There was a terrible cracking noise, and the wire strained under her weight. The plaster of the ceiling around the fixture came down in plate-sized chunks, cracking further as it hit the floor. Then the lantern came away in Tanya's hands. The light bulb smashed as she fell to the floor, and the lantern went flying out of her grasp and hit the wardrobe, shattering. As Tanya lay winded, she heard the landing creaking with anxious footsteps. She did not need to look up to know that the fairies would be gone, vanished as they always did, like a scattering of leaves on the breeze. Then her mother was in the room, pulling her up by her shoulders, causing her to cry out. Tanya caught her exclamation of disgust as she surveyed the mess. Mum, she croaked, it was a nightmare. I'm sorry. Even in the moonlight, Tanya could see the resigned expression on her mother's face. She released her grip on Tanya's arm and slowly sank down on the bed, her hand clenching into balls as she pressed into her eye sockets. Mum, Tanya whispered. She reached over and touched her mother's arm. I don't know what to do anymore, her mother said quietly. I can't cope with this attention-seeking of yours. I can't cope with you. Don't say that. I'll be better. I promise I'll try. Her mother gave a weird smile. It's what you always say, and I want to believe you to help you. But I can't. Not if you won't talk to me or a doctor. I don't need a doctor, and you wouldn't understand. No, you're right, love, I don't. The only thing I do understand is that I'm at the end of my tether. She paused to look around at the mess. Well, you're going to clean it all up in the morning, every last bit of it, and the damage comes out of your pocket money, however long it might take. I'm not having this any more. Tony stared at the floor. A shard of glass glinted in her mother's bare foot. She knelt down and gently pulled it out, watching as a dark bead of blood formed in its place. Her mother did not react. Instead, she got up and shuffled to the floor, her shoulders drooping, her feet crunching over the fragments of glass, uncaring. Mum? The bedroom door closed, leaving her in darkness. Tonya lay on her bed, too shocked even to cry. The look on her mother's face had said it all. How many times had she been warned? How many times had she been told about the so-called last straw? Because now, as she listened to the muffled sobbing from across the landing, she knew that tonight really had been the last straw for her mother. Oh, this is going to take some practice. My jaw hurts. That was the end of chapter 1, by the way. This really is an amazing book. It's so well written. It's just the images that it's able to conjure up, the detail. The detail, just everything in it is so amazing. The only reason I hope they would never make a movie of this is because there's no way that a movie could do this book any justice. Chapter 2. The car moved slowly along the winding lane. On either side of the road lay acres of nothing but golden fields and green trees, the latter forming a dense canopy of leaves and branches overhead that the July sunshine could barely penetrate. Occasionally, a farmhouse or paddock of animals would come into view in the distance, but apart from this, there was little else to see, for this was the heart of the Essex countryside. The built-up views of London were long gone. Is that how you say it, Essex or Essex? I have no idea. In the back seat of the car, Tanya sat, staring stonily at the back of her mother's head. I still don't see why I have to stay with her. There must be somewhere else I can go. There isn't anywhere else you can go, said her mother, her face pale with lack of sleep and devoid of her usual makeup. We've been through this 100 times already. Why can't I just go to Dad's, said Tanya. You already know the answer to that. He told us weeks ago that he'd be working away a lot over the next few months. You can't stay in an empty house. I can't believe this. A week. A lousy week into the summer holidays, and I have to spend a huge chunk of it with her, said Tanya. I wouldn't have minded going to Nana Ivy's. Well, Nana Ivy isn't here anymore. She died 3 years ago, and it wouldn't hurt you to make more of an effort to get along with the grandmother you've still got. Yeah, because she really makes a lot of trouble for me, doesn't she? It's bad enough being stuck in that horrible cobwebby house for a couple of days at a time, and even then it's only because you insist on it. That's not true. Yes, it is. She doesn't want me there any more than I want to be there, and we both know it. Name one time, just once, that she's ever invited me of her own accord, Tanya challenged. Her mother stayed silent. Tanya pursed her lips. No, didn't think so. That's enough. You brought this upon yourself with your behavior last night, not to mention the last few months. Her mother's tone softened. I need a break. I think we both do. Just for a couple of weeks, that's all. I'm being as fair as I can. I'm even letting you take Oberon with you. And then, when you come back, we're going to have a serious talk. Tanya said nothing, trying to will away the awful lump in her throat. After a few wordless moments, her mother turned on the radio. It was a pointed end to the discussion. A low whine came from the throat of the slightly overweight brown Doberman, whose bottom was wedged between Tanya and the large carryall containing her belongings. Oh, I'm out of breath. She rested a hand on the back of his head, scratching behind his silky ears to comfort him, and gazed out of the window miserably. Her protestations had not made the slightest difference. The outcome was the same. She would be staying with her grandmother until further notice. The journey continued. In the front of the car, her mother stared straight ahead at the road. In the back, Tanya continued to scowl at her mother's head with all her might. Here we are, said Tanya. Tanya looked in the direction her mother had pointed, but could see nothing, only rows of dense trees and bushes. It's a bit more overgrown than usual. It's always overgrown, Tonya snapped. If it was any worse, we'd have missed it completely. There were so many trees lining the lane that it was impossible to see where it ended. Branches and twigs scraped along the side of the car, and numerous fairies were flying out of the trees, disgruntled at the interruption. One settled on the window next to Tanya and staring at her inquisitively. They remained for about a minute, a grubby finger rummaging in its nostril all the while. To her relief, it soon became bored of sizing her up and flew back up to the trees. She sighed, knowing to expect more of the same. Somehow the fairies always knew she could see them, and it seemed to draw them to her like a magnet, even when she did her utmost to feign ignorance of their existence. The lane continued, twisting and turning as though it were part of a labyrinth they would never find their way out of. Eventually the trees grew sparser and the road lighter, and after a final turn to the left, the car drew to a halt before a huge set of padlocked gates. Worked into the wrought iron framework were two words, Elveston Manor. I've always read it as Elveston. I'm not sure if that's correct. On a stone pillar on either side of the gate, a gargoyle bared its teeth. Her mother blasted the car horn a couple of times and glared at the clock on the dashboard. Why haven't they opened the gates yet? We told them to expect us around 10 o'clock. She tooted again in annoyance. Several minutes passed with no sign of anyone coming. Tanya averted her eyes from the gargoyle's unwelcoming expressions. Over the top of the high wall, she could just make out the roof of the house. We might as well get out and stretch our legs, said her mother, opening the door and clambering out. Tanya followed, glad to escape from the hot, cramped car. Oberon bounded over to the trees, first sniffing, then marking his new territory. All this fresh country air will do you a world of good. Tanya shot her mother a venomous look and stared around at the land outside the gates. In the distance, she could hear the bells ringing out and recalled a little church nearby. Apart from this, the house stood alone, and although the journey had taken a little more than a couple of hours, it felt like they were in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated from the rest of the world. I would love a place like that. Tanya shielded her eyes from the sun and gazed into the distance. A dark figure was walking briskly toward them. It's Warwick, said her mother, sounding relieved. Tanya lowered her gaze and kicked at a pebble. She was not particularly fond of the manor's groundskeeper. Years ago, when her mother had been there as a child, the job had belonged to Warwick's father, Amos. I've always read it as Amos. It might be Amos. Amos? Amos actually sounds better. When Amos had retired, the job had been passed along to his son. The two of them lived in the house along with Tanya's grandmother, Florence, and Warwick's son, Fabian, who was, in her mother's words, a nuisance. Although this did have a slight ring of truth to it, Tanya could not help but feel some sympathy for Fabian, whose mother had died when he was just 5. Judging by what little guidance he had from his father, it was no surprise he turned out to be difficult. Warwick drew closer. He was wearing a long overcoat and looked far too warm for the weather. Dirty moleskin trousers that were tucked into equally dirty boots. His straggly hair was peppered with gray and tied back loosely, and his skin was brown and leathery, evidence that he had spent much of his time outdoors. Apologies. His only greeting was a sullen nod. He strode past them, unlocking the gates, and then motioned for them to get back in the car. Tanya noticed with distaste that he had an air rifle strapped on his back. The gates creaked as he swung them open, and then he stepped to one side to allow the car to pass. As always, Tanya's eyes widened as she drove in the side of the house. There was no question that it would have been an impressive view when it was first built in the late 18th century. It had close... Okay. Sorry. No, wait. 21st. So the 18th. 21st, 20th, 18th. 17th. It's built in the late 1700s? Anyway. It had close to 20 bedrooms, not including the old servants' quarters, and almost as many parlors and sitting rooms, once decorated lavishly. Had it been properly maintained, it would probably still be beautiful. Instead, thick ivy climbed the cracked walls, growing wilder with each year, even snaking over the windows like leafy shrouds. Most rooms were now either locked or in various states of dilapidation, and the vast, once splendid grounds spanning the house ran wild and unkempt. The forecourt at the front of the house was a frothing sea of weeds, and the only thing that graced the gardens were a few trees and a disused water fountain. It had not worked for as long as Tanya could remember. After parking, they waited at the door for Warwick. He strolled heavily across the gravel in the forecourt and up the steps to the grand front door, ushering them inside. Oberon remained outside, panting in the shade of the house. It's never occurred to me how many little words I've missed just by reading it to myself. Reading out loud, I gotta read every one of them, and even then I realize that I missed one and I have to make up for it in my following sentence. Oh dear. How many pages? Okay, that's not many. The smell of the hallway was always the same, damp and musty, with an underlying hint of Florence's perfume. Tanya grimaced at the sight of the peeling, faded wallpaper in disapproval, wondering for the 100th time why her grandmother continued to live in such an enormous house when it was clearly too big for her to look after. On both sides of the gloomy corridor were doors that Tanya knew from experience would be locked. Few rooms in the house were used these days. Farther along, the hallway opened out into a lobby, where there were several more doors and the main set of stairs, which led up to a small landing and then branched off in two different directions to the first floor. The second floor, which had served as the old servants' quarters, was pretty much out of bounds to everyone except Amos. Tanya could remember having been up there only once for a dare, and had raced back down, shrieking, after Fabian pretended to have seen a ghost. "This way," said Warwick, speaking at last in his usual brusque manner. On the first landing stood an old grandfather clock that had never worked properly, despite being mended several times. Tanya had a pretty good insight into why. It had been full of fairies for years. This was another reason she hated the place. It was absolutely crawling with fairies. She followed Warwick up the stairs, leaving her mother below. The moment her back was turned, a snide voice sounded from the depths of the clock. "Look out for the little one. She's trickety." Okay, I've got to find fairy voices for the little annoying ones. Sonia ignored it and climbed the final few stairs. At the top, she froze. I'm sorry. It occurred to me to speak like Gollum. "Look out for the little one." I can't do it. My mouth is too dry. Anyway, at the top of the stairs, she froze. A trail of richly colored feathers led to a rickety dresser on which sat a fat ginger cat with one eye and a mouth full of feathers. "It's stuffed," said Warwick, sounding bored. Tanya spotted a stuffed pheasant on the floor, with its head and half of its feathers missing, and felt a mixture of relief and revulsion. "Spitfire! Go on, get out of it," Warwick ordered. I can't even come close to... What are y'all saying? Hang on. Okay, sorry. Stopping to read the chat. "Hi, I'm lost." "Hi, same. I have no idea what's happening. Could you start over and explain?" "Yeah, hello." "Hi, Phoenix, help. I don't understand. Could you explain?" No, I'm not going to explain, because as soon as I'm done with this video, it's going to be up there and you can watch the beginning. I'm not starting that again, because it was terrible. Okay. Spitfire stared back with his unblinking eye and continued to chew insolently. "By the way, I'm reading a book." I'm just reading a book. Skippy. My sister. Warwick stepped past him in exasperation and paused by the first door on the left. "Your room," Tanya gave it. Oh my gosh, it says left. I've been imagining it on the wrong side of the house this whole time. No! Ah! Tanya gave a mute nod. The room he had shown her to was the same one she always stayed in, so being escorted to it seemed rather pointless. She could only think of two reasons why Warwick would want to do this, either to make himself appear courteous, or because he did not trust her to go snooping in other rooms. Going by what she knew of his general demeanor, she concluded that it was more likely to be the second reason. Like most of the rooms in the house, Tanya's was spacious but sparsely furnished. The carpet was bare, and the walls were covered in lavender paper that was peeling off in some places. In the corner there stood a small table and chair, and in the center a bed had been freshly made up, the crisp white pillowcases still retaining their creases from being pressed. A thin scarlet blanket lay folded at the foot. On the wall opposite the bed was a cast-iron fireplace, next to which stood a door to a small black bathroom for her personal use. Unfortunately, it also happened to be inhabited by a slimy, amphibian-like fairy with a penchant for all things shiny. Tanya had lost many a watch and several items of jewelry to the thieving creature, and more than once witnessed a bewildered Warwick retrieving all manner of glittering objects from the sink pipe in the bathroom. Above the fireplace hung a painting of Narcissus and Echo, the handsome youth gazing at his reflection in a woodland pool while the maiden looked on, unnoticed. Tanya had never quite decided whether she liked it or not. Wait for it. She deposited her bag on the bed and emptied it. Unsurprisingly, after she had put everything away, the room still looked as empty as ever. Tanya placed her slippers at the foot of the bed, vaguely recalling a time when Spitfire had left a rat's tail in one of them. She concluded that the chances of a repeat were unlikely. At 16, Spitfire was practically an antique in cat years. Apart from attacking the stuffed game in the corridors, the most he was capable of catching these days was a spider or two, or perhaps a housefly if he was lucky. She walked over to the windowsill and trailed her finger along it, leaving a thin line in the ever-present layer of grime. The view from the window looked out over the gardens at the side of the house, in which she saw a few wild rose bushes and a couple of trees. Beyond the wall sat the church with its tiny graveyard, and in the distance a vast expanse of woodland, now known as Hangman's Wood. I now get why she can see all that from that window, because I've always imagined it on the other side. Okay, I'm sorry. She watched as her mother clambered into the car in the courtyard, ready to leave, and was glad she had chosen to avoid saying goodbye. At best it would have been upsetting, and at worst caused another argument. Tanya walked back to the bed and slowly sank down on it. In the cracked mirror of the dressing table, her reflection was split in two. Twin faces with brown eyes and dark hair stared back from an olive-skinned face. Tanya averted her eyes. She had never felt more alone. End of chapter 2, and boy, I'm going to try and read more tomorrow, because this is going to become a daily thing. I love this book so much. I really, really do. I actually, there are cards that used to be available, and they're not anymore, but I emailed the website and got an email back from the author herself, and, well, I got the cards with the characters on them, and it's so amazing. It's actually a really fun game, too. Let's see. Ooh, hey! They don't actually give 100% accurate descriptions, so this one was Raven. This one was Gredden. This one was Mustache Man, Feathercap. And let's see, we have met... There isn't one of Tanya's mother, but there is one right here of Warwick. And where's Tanya? There she is. And here is Tanya, who will meet Fabian and Tanya's grandmother in the next chapter. Alright, that is all for today. Adios.